In today's podcast, we're going to talk about a grim catch-22 facing our nation. Do we continue to let inflation run roughshod over our purchasing power, or do we raise interest rates and risk plunging our country into a recession? Hey folks, I'm best-selling author David McKnight. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell is fast approaching a grim crossroad where he may have to raise interest rates in order to rein in out-of-control inflation. Remember, one of the tools that the Fed has at its disposal to stem the tide of inflation is to raise interest rates. You may recall that recently Venezuela had inflation approaching 40%, so their government raised interest rates to 42%. While inflation in our country is not as out of control, Jerome Powell will soon be facing a similar decision. He may have to raise interest rates in order to tamp down inflation. The problem, however, is that by so doing, he could plunge the country into a recession. So Jerome Powell is now in the unenviable position of having to push the economy into a recession in order to rein in inflation. Recently, Jerome Powell acknowledged that getting price pressures under control could require some pain and maybe even higher unemployment. However, he's avoided using that politically fraught word recession. But this may just be a question of semantics. According to Alan Blinder, former U.S. central bank policymaker, quote, "The chairman of the Fed doesn't want to let the R word slip out of his mouth, but there are a lot of euphemisms and he'll use them," close quote. More and more economists think it could take an economic contraction, read recession, and higher unemployment to bring inflation down to more tolerable levels, which most experts agree is in the 2 to 3% range. Recently, chief economist of JP Morgan Chase & Company said, quote, "I've become more pessimistic about the opportunity of stabilizing inflation at an acceptable level without a recession," close quote. On June 6, Bloomberg economics chief U.S. economist Anna Wong put the chance of a recession this year at 1 in 4 and of one next year at 3 in 4. She said, quote, "A downturn in 2020 is unlikely, but recession in 2023 will be tough to avoid," close quote. Okay, folks, it's time for the Power of Zero question of the day. Do you think we're heading towards a recession sometime in the next 2 years? Feel free to put your answers in the comments section below. Where interest rates go in the next few months depends in part on how quickly the Fed wants to cool inflation and how much pain they're willing to inflict on the economy to pull that off. But Powell has to make a move soon because the longer inflation stays elevated, the greater the likelihood we'll see a repeat of what we saw in the 1970s, where inflation persisted for nearly a decade. So there's a lot of pressure on Jerome Powell to do something and to do it quickly, but it's a very fine line he has to walk. If he's overly aggressive, it could push the economy into a very severe recession that sends unemployment skyrocketing. Now, you may be asking yourself, how did we paint ourselves into this corner? How did we come to the point in time where we're staring down two such dire alternatives? Well, you have to go back to the decision to shut down the economy in the face of COVID-19 in March of 2020. That COVID shutdown blew a massive hole in the economy, and the Fed was forced to build a bridge to span that abyss. You want to know how much that bridge cost? $6 trillion. We borrowed more money in 1 month than we had in the previous 6 years combined. So here we are 2 years on, and the financial chickens are coming home to roost. We are now paying the price for all that wanton debt spending of 2020. A lot of that money is now floating around in the economy, and you have too many dollars chasing too few products. So naturally, prices are beginning to rise. Now, are there some other tangential explanations for why we're seeing such persistent inflation? Sure. You got the war in Ukraine, you got the supply chain crisis, but most of this is being driven by the fact that we added $6 trillion to the national debt. So let's talk about what all this means for people like you who are trying to shield yourselves from the impact of higher taxes down the road so you can wring as much efficiency from your retirement savings as possible. Well, we know that one of the biggest line items in the U.S. budget in the coming years are going to be Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and you guessed it, interest on the national debt. Well, what do you suppose happens to the cost of servicing that $30 trillion of debt and climbing when interest rates go up? Well, that cost goes up as well. Remember, the U.S. debt is short-term debt, which means that the U.S. has to refinance it every few years. So as interest rates go up, the countries, entities, and individuals who have loaned us money will require that we pay the prevailing rates of interest. If all interest rates did was return to historically normal levels, in fact, the cost of servicing the national debt would triple or even quadruple. So, as the cost of servicing all this debt goes up, it will start to crowd out all other federal spending. So in order to pay for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and just the general costs of running the federal government, we are going to have to raise more revenue, and that can only mean one thing: your taxes are going up. So if you have the lion's share of your retirement savings in 401ks or IRAs, you may want to think strongly about systematically shifting those assets to tax-free. Remember, you want to do it slowly enough that you don't rise into a tax bracket that gives you heartburn, but you want to do it quickly enough that you get all the heavy lifting done before tax rates go up for good. Pro tip: if you're converting up to the top of the 24% tax bracket, which is $340,100 of taxable income, if you're married and filing jointly, then that is your sweet spot. 10 years from now, you'll look back at the 24% tax bracket as a good deal of historic proportions. If you need some help navigating these types of strategies, head on over to davidmcknight.com and opt in for a complimentary strategy session. I'm happy to give you a hand. Don't forget to click like, subscribe, and the bell so you never miss a video. And feel free to make comments or ask questions in the comment section below. This is David McKnight. I look forward to seeing you on the next video.